to psychology. I'll try not to get too deep into any of these things that we're discussing today because most of them do come up again in other chapters. We'll start by defining psychology. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of mind and behavior. And as you'll see, the different realms of psychology and different psychologists in history really focused more on mind or behavior, but it really is both, mind and behavior. And the other key here is that it's the scientific study of mind and behavior. Students who study psychology will develop critical thinking skills, become familiar with the scientific method, and recognize the complexity of behavior. All scientists test things which is perceivable and measurable. So, psychological science is no exception. It's empirical based on measurable data. As you'll see, sometimes this data can be more subjective or more objective, but it's always measurable data because it is science. Over on the right-hand side is a little model of the scientific method, which basically has 5 steps. The first is to ask a question. Now, this isn't just a random question. When you're taking part in the scientific method, or if you're a scientist, your question needs to be based on previous research or observations, something scientific, something or a theory, something that gives you a reason to ask that question. After asking a question, you form a hypothesis, which is a prediction. Then you test that hypothesis with either a true experiment or other forms of data collection. After that, you analyze the results using the statistical methods we'll discuss in Chapter 2. And finally, if you're a scientist, you'll publish your research when you're done so other scientists can read it and learn from it and formulate their own questions from your publications and start this scientific method all over from the beginning. For a little while now, we're going to discuss the history of psychology, and we'll do that by mostly discussing the prominent figures at the time, the important psychologists. And this is always going to be helpful for your term paper where you need to study 3 famous psychologists. Perhaps you'll hear of someone today who you want to include in your paper. So the first guy we're going to talk about is Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist, and he's actually considered like the father of psychology or the founder of psychology as a science. It wasn't until the late 1800s that psychology even became accepted as an academic discipline, and Wilhelm Wundt, as well as William James, who we'll discuss in a moment, really the two of them are credited with being the founders of psychology as a science. Wundt was the first person to actually be called a psychologist. He wrote psychology books. He focused more on internal perception or introspection and conscious experience. He believed in voluntarism, which is that humans have free will, and that as well that they should be informed in things that they're doing, like experiments. He also suggested that psychology should include the study of culture, which was kind of before his time. That was cool that he knew about that. And finally, Wundt established the first psychology lab in Germany in 1879. So right around the time when psychology was really being accepted as a science for the first time. Edward Titchener, who was one of Wundt's students, went on to develop structuralism, which focuses on the different components or different parts of the mind, the structure of the mind, if you will. Now we'll talk about William James, the American psychologist, the first American psychologist who also kind of got this psychology science thing started along with Wundt. James's perspective, as opposed to structuralism like Wundt, he studied functionalism, how he learned a lot about Darwinism and wanted to learn about how mental activities can help an organism fit into its environment, the adaptation side of things. And he also focused on the whole mind rather than its parts. So the actual functional part of the mind as opposed to the structure of the mind like Wundt. However, both psychologists really used a lot of introspection. James did use some more objective measures, but both were criticized for using very subjective measures, asking people about their thoughts or their feelings, which is really not all that scientific. You can see on the right-hand side this little graphic comparing structuralism and functionalism. Feel free to pause and read that one. Kind of interesting that functionalism influenced the educational system, but we'll talk more about that another time. Some other important historical psychologists. You may have heard of Freud before. He may be the most famous psychologist ever. He was actually an Austrian neurologist before focusing on psychology. And he really was interested in the unconscious, things that you didn't know you were thinking or feeling. He believed in psychoanalytic theory, where a lot of things had different meanings than you might think on the surface. The importance of childhood experiences with different stages that he proposed children went through. And he used methods such as dream analysis, word association, and Freudian slips, which are when you say the wrong word by accident, but it's not totally an accident. There's actually a deeper meaning to why you mixed up your words like that. So Freud's methods were also criticized for not being all that scientific, although he was a scientist himself. However, a lot of his theories really influenced future things in psychology, and I suspect a lot of you may choose to discuss Freud in your term papers. 3 other German psychologists who actually escaped from Nazi Germany to the US were Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, and Wolfgang Kohler. They were interested in Gestalt principles, which Gestalt is German for whole, and they really wanted to focus not on different parts of the mind, but as the whole mind, and how, even more so, how the sensory experience of anything, whether you're listening to something or tasting something or seeing something, that it can be broken down to its parts, but that's not what's important. What's important is the sum of those parts. This picture on the right-hand side, the black and white one, is a good example of a Gestalt principle. If you look at each of these dots separately, it doesn't mean very much. They each have a different arrow-like shape on it. But when you put them all together, as you can see, it makes a cube. So Gestalt principles really focus on the importance and the value of seeing things, including the mind and the person, as a whole instead of just as its parts. A little bit later, so Freud was right around the early 1900s. I believe Freud passed away right at the beginning of World War II. And soon after that, behaviorism sort of came into fashion. It was a new thing going on in psychology. And the really good part about behaviorism is that it's more objective. You can measure behavior much more objectively than you can measure thoughts or feelings, right? You can easily measure how many times a rat presses the button, whereas it's hard to measure how happy somebody is. Even if you have them fill out a scale of 1 to 10, my 9 may be different than your 9, right? But if I press a button 9 times, it's the same as you pressing a button 9 times. So behavior is much more easily studied scientifically. And 3 big guys in behaviorism were Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. John B. Watson was really the first person to shift the focus of psychology from the mind to behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, now we consider psychology to be the study of both the mind and behavior. But Watson was the first one to say, hey, it's not just about what you're thinking. It's not just about how your mind is made up, what the parts that it's made up of or what it does functionally. It's also about what people do. How do they behave? How does it affect your outward behavior? So Watson became the father of behaviorism. And Pavlov and Skinner both discovered different types of conditioning, or not discovered, but made famous different types of conditioning. First, I'll talk about Ivan Pavlov. He worked with classical conditioning, Pavlov worked with classical conditioning or conditioned reflex, which is where he takes a natural reflex that already happens, such as a dog salivating over its food. I don't know if you have a pet and you've ever seen your dog will drool or your cat will come running and have reflexes to the food. So when Pavlov noticed that the dogs were drooling over the food, I believe it was the sound of the can opener or the cupboard opening that was making them drool even before they saw the food. So Pavlov decided to conduct an experiment, and every time he fed the dogs, he would ring a bell. Over time, they would salivate when just the bell was rang and not the food at all. They were conditioned to drool or salivate over just the ringing of the bell, even with no food there at all. We'll actually talk a lot more about classical conditioning in a future chapter, so don't worry if you didn't totally get that whole dog experiment. We'll go into that more. B.F. Skinner focused on operant conditioning, which uses reinforcements, positive and negative reinforcements, to change behavior. So behavior can be influenced by its consequences. And the Skinner box was what he made famous. He put a rat inside with a lever it could press to get food, and rewarded the rat in different ways with food or no food in order to increase or extinguish behaviors. Again, we'll talk more about Skinner in a later chapter. But these are all very important, interesting guys who brought forth the idea of behaviorism, which is still here today in psychology. Around the same time as behaviorism was becoming popular, so was humanism. Humanism emphasizes personal control, intentionality, free will, and a basic human predisposition for good. That was like the main thing. People are good, and if we just get down to the core of it, everybody's good and has free will, and we just need to sort of untap or tap into that goodness, and then they can use their free will for good. Abraham Maslow is very famous for putting forth the hierarchy of human needs in motivating behavior. He says that behavior is motivated by these, whether or not these needs are met, and your behavior will be different depending on if these needs are met or not. And starting at the bottom are the most important needs, the biological and physiological needs like food and sleep and water. On top of that is safety, things like security, health, and finances. Those are your basic needs, and it's hard to really grow as a person until those basic needs are met. Once your biological and safety needs are met, you can move up the pyramid to the love and belonging, sometimes called social needs, which involve friendship, intimacy, family, connections, relationships, all of those social things, along with esteem on top of that, which involves things like respect, status, recognition, strength, and self-esteem. Esteem and love and belonging make up your psychological needs. Also very, very important, but not quite as important as those basic needs. You don't need them to stay alive, but you do need them to reach that final stage or final goal of self-actualization, where you really meet your full potential in life. And this part is different for every person. Up until then, everyone sort of has these same needs that need to be met. But once you get to self-actualization, that's where we can really see individual differences. So Maslow is famous for his hierarchy of human needs, which is still often used in all different types of psychology and education and human resources and all sorts of things. It's very useful. It's worth mentioning that humanistic psychology is mostly based on qualitative research as opposed to quantitative. So qualitative is using words to describe things as opposed to numbers. It doesn't mean it's not scientific, and it doesn't mean it's not objective, but it's a different type of research when we're writing down words instead of numbers, when our data is made up of categories instead of values. Another famous humanist is Carl Rogers. He was more interested in therapy and counseling and that sort of thing, and he developed something called client-centered therapy. It's a technique that therapists still use today, and it basically Rogers proposed that therapists should have 3 traits no matter what. They need to show unconditional positive regard for their client. They always like and support and respect their client. Genuineness and empathy. And that if the therapist can do those things, the client can sort of take it from there. The patient or the client who needs the therapy or wants the therapy can kind of help themselves as long as they have that therapist there listening, providing those 3 things: unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. The book does a really good job of explaining it, so definitely pay extra attention when you're reading this part in the book. Also around this same time, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, was cognitive psychology, or the cognitive revolution, which started cognitive psychology. as you recall, the earlier guys like Wundt and James were focused on the mind. After that, we shifted more to behavior because it was more scientific to study behavior. It was easier to measure, right? But now that other sciences were getting invented and becoming popular, like linguistics and neuroscience and computer science, especially neuroscience, that was a big one, we were finally able to scientifically measure things in the mind. So cognitive psychology was born, and the cognitive sciences emerged when psychologists began to cooperate with scientists in other fields. Another example here is anthropology, and we'll get into cognition a lot more later and cognitive psychology, but it's very interesting. And Noam Chomsky is known as sort of the starter or the father of the cognitive revolution. This picture down here is a beautiful mural in his hometown in Pennsylvania that was painted in his honor. And he's an American linguist who disliked the focus of psychology being on behavior and wanted to refocus on the mind again, because through his studies in linguistics, he was learning about all these sciences emerging related to the mind and neuroscience. So he kind of started this cognitive revolution. And then in 1967, someone named Ulrich Nesser published the first textbook called Cognitive Psychology. If you do a quick Google, you'll see there are lots of textbooks called Cognitive Psychology, lots and lots and lots. But Nesser wrote the first one in 1967. Also around this same period of time, feminist psychology became a thing, which was good because until now, pretty much all the psychologists were white males. For many, many years, since the beginning of psychology, white males totally dominated the field, as they did and do in many fields. And this really had negative consequences for people who weren't white and male, especially because psychology is studying humans. We need to study all kinds of humans, right? So in the 1960s, a Jewish woman named Naomi Weinstein started the feminist revolution in psychology by really critiquing psychology as a science. She was saying it's not scientific if males are constructing the psychology of females completely out of their own cultural biases. Psychology has already acknowledged that there are cultural biases, yet we have a bunch of men sitting here telling us how women think. So Weinstein really started this movement, and feminist psychology took off from there. Although there were women interested in psychology before the 1960s, of course. And one example was Mary Calkins, who in the mid-1890s completed all of the requirements towards her PhD in psychology from Harvard. But Harvard refused to award her the degree because she was a woman. And she worked with many famous psychologists, and they tried to fight for her and get her that degree, and it was never awarded to her due to her gender. An important quote, or a quote that I personally really like from Naomi Weinstein, is over on the right. It says, "Psychologists have set about describing the true nature of women with a certainty and a sense of their own infallibility rarely found in the secular world." I think what she means by this is that psychology is basically the only science that was describing things with such certainty and infallibility. Other sciences, the definition of science is that we need to keep testing things. We need to check things. We're not always right. But she felt like the men who were dominating the field were describing women with such a sense of infallibility that it was bordering on not even being science anymore. So that's what really started the feminist revolution in psychology. And another important issue around this time was people of color in psychology, which was also very limited. The book gives a few examples. I have one important one here, who is Francis Cecil Sumner. He's the first Black American to earn his PhD in psychology, so the first African-American psychologist. He worked with G. Stanley Hall, who actually was the founder of the APA. And he graduated from Clark University, I believe. And then he went on to work at Howard, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a very famous, prestigious black university in Washington, D.C. And from 1928 to 54, Sumner was the chair of the psychology department at Howard University. He's a very respected psychologist. Going back up to our definitions, it's important to know the difference between multicultural and cross-cultural psychology. So multicultural psychology is based on one country with different cultures in it. For example, if I'm working in the United States, I might study Asian Americans and European Americans and compare those two populations. Multicultural is in one country, but you're looking at people from different ethnicities or races or countries. Whereas cross-cultural psychology is comparing populations who live in different countries. So they're not different cultures living in the same country, they're living in completely different countries. Cross-cultural psychologists, for example, might have participants from the United States compared to people from China, people who live in different countries. And I added this quote here on the bottom right because I thought it was a good summary of the problem with all the psychologists being white and being American. It says, theories and data derived from white American settings could be assumed to apply to individuals and social groups from other cultures, and this is unlikely to be true. So it was really a problem that all of the psychological data was coming from white American settings, and this is sort of where the birth of multicultural and cross-cultural psychology came in. Here's a quick review of some of the different schools of psychology. I didn't make this graphic, I just found it, but I thought it would be helpful. Feel free to pause and read this one or study it real quick for the quiz. And now we'll move on to contemporary psychology. Before this, we talked about the history, all of the different movements and different schools of thought over time. Now we're going to talk about now. Although even though we're talking about now, a lot of these things started back during that historical period, such as the APA. The American Psychological Association, or the APA, was actually founded back in 1892. It's the largest organization of psychologists in the world, although it only includes people from the United States. Only psychologists from the United States are members of the APA. And the APA has 56 different divisions, which you can see over here on the right-hand side. I just took a screenshot from their website. You do not need to learn these or memorize them or even understand them all. They're just there to show you all the different disciplines in psychology, all the different divisions of the APA, and how broad psychology can be, from things like consumer psychology to things like the Society of Addiction Psychology, Society for Media Psychology, Clinical Psychology, School Psychology, Rehabilitation Psychology. There are really so many different kinds, and that will also be relevant to your term paper, which we'll talk about in another video. G. Stanley Hall, who we mentioned earlier, was the first president of the APA, and you're going to get real familiar with APA formatting when it's time to write your paper, because we need to use APA format in psychology papers. Another association is the APS, the Association for Psychological Science. This is much newer, founded in 1988. This one's not only American, it has psychologists from all over the world, and it seeks to advance the scientific orientation of psychology, really keeping things scientific. Now we're actually going to talk about, I think, 13 different areas of contemporary psychology. So on the last slide, we saw all the different divisions of the APA, but we're going to discuss 13 main ones. And some of these could be broken down, and I may have left out some, but these are the ones I'd like you to learn for this chapter. The first is biopsychology, which explores how our biology influences our behavior. Some examples of areas of study in biopsychology are sleep, drug use, motor skills, and biological correlates of psychological disorders, right? Physical things that are related to psychological disorders. Evolutionary psychology, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting types of psychology. It studies the behavior in the context of evolution, It looks at our biological and evolutionary roots of behavior, and they study things like memory, mating, relationships, parenting, kinship. I worked with an evolutionary psychologist in grad school, and her research was so interesting. Sensation and perception is also very interesting. I remember taking that class in my undergraduate degree, and I really enjoyed it. My favorite part was the optical illusions the teacher would show us. Sensation and perception studies both the physiological aspects of your sensory systems, as well as the psychological experience of receiving that sensory information. So remember, your sensory means your 5 senses, right? So the actual physiological way that you see something or hear something, as well as the psychological way that you experience that information being sent to your brain. Some things that are studied in this discipline include optical illusions, speech, spatial perception, and attention, plus lots more. Cognitive psychology, as I mentioned earlier, is very popular. Focuses on studying cognitions or thoughts, the thought process, the mind, and the relationship to our experiences and our actions. So you see how it's the mind, but related to behavior, right? Some topics that are very popular in psychology include memory, language, and problem solving. Memory is such an interesting topic to learn about. We'll talk more about that in another chapter. Over to the right-hand side, we have developmental psychology, which is the study of development across a lifespan. It focuses on the cognitive and behavioral changes, so mind and behavior, at all the different stages of life. When you learn developmental psychology, often it's broken down into infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and later life. Sometimes developmental psychology also discusses death and dying and grief. Personality psychology is something we'll talk a lot about later in the course. Focuses on personality traits, which are stable parts of who you are that don't change during your life. Personality psychology measures these traits and looks at how they interact with the environment to determine your behavior. One of the most important topics in personality psychology is the big 5 personality traits, which are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We'll talk lots more about those later, and there's a diagram in the textbook that explains it very well. It gives some examples of behaviors. You can also, if you Google it, you can take a test and see which big 5 personality traits you have the most and the least of. These are stable traits, and they have predictive value. You can use them once you know how you score on the big 5, you can use it to predict future behavior. Social psychology, which is what I did my master's degree in at UH, focuses on how we interact with and relate to others. Some topics in social psychology are attraction, prejudice, cooperation, and modeling. My master's thesis was actually very interesting. It was right when dating websites were first becoming a thing, and I used them to study playing hard to get. Maybe I'll dig that up and share it with you guys if I can find it. Finally, on this slide, we have industrial organizational psychology. This one applies psychological theories and principles and research to the workplace, industrial and organizational settings, workplace environments. Some topics in industrial organizational psychology include hiring, training, performance evaluations, leadership, teams, all sorts of different things. I actually teach a psychology of work class where we focus on industrial organizational psychology. It's a lot more interesting than it sounds. All right, a few more areas of psychology. We have health psychology, which focuses on how health is affected by the interaction of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. Health psychologists often use the biopsychosocial model, which really focuses on the interaction of all of those things, your biological parts of your body, psychological, mind and behavior, and sociocultural things all working together to affect your health. Some topics in health psychology include stress management, healthcare, and genetic predispositions. Sport and exercise psychology, also really interesting. I remember that class very well. It studies the psychological aspects of sport performance, for example, motivation or performance anxiety. Clinical psychology focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, dissociative identity disorder, which was previously known as multiple personality disorder. Very interesting. We'll talk all about psychological disorders at the very end of this course. Save the best for last. I find that the most interesting part of psychology, I think. Counseling psychology is a little bit different than clinical psychology because it focuses on the well-being of people who are psychologically healthy. So you don't need to have a disorder to benefit from counseling. I'm sure we've all heard that. I hope you all know that you do not need to have a diagnosable disorder to benefit from counseling or therapy. So counseling psychology focuses on how to use counseling for people who are not diagnosed with a disorder. So they study types of therapy, stress management, emotions, even things like marriage and family counseling would be in counseling psychology. And then finally, forensic psychology, also interesting. I know, I think they're all really interesting, but that's why I chose to stick with psychology. Forensic psychology handles questions of psychology as they arise in the context of the justice system. So in the courts or the prison system, they study things or learn about things like eyewitness accounts. They can assess somebody's competency to stand trial, and they even help the courts with things like sentencing and treatment for offenders. So that's forensic psychology. All right, we talked about all our different areas of psychology. Now we'll quickly discuss some careers in psychology. We're almost done. You do need a PhD if you want to work at a university studying psychology, doing research, and getting your PhD requires a dissertation. The book gives more details about that if you're interested for that personally, but you don't need to know more than this for me. In some fields of psychology, individuals who have recently earned their PhD take part in something called postdoctoral training programs. These are more specific to their exact field of research. And then a PsyD is more based in clinical psychology as opposed to research psychology. A doctor of psychology degree, which is more popular amongst people in clinical psychology. They're less research oriented and more therapy and clinical and diagnosing kind of stuff. On the right hand side, you could see a pie chart. It's, as you can tell, a little bit outdated. It's numbers from back in 2009, but it shows where people with PhDs in psychology work, right? And as you can see, a lot of them work in hospitals and health services and universities, followed by government. You can take a look at that. All right, time for our summary. I know this looks like a lot. You don't have to watch this part now. Feel free to turn off the video. But I think this summary is very helpful, and it's good to have this slide open when you're doing your quiz. It is totally fine to have this open while you're doing your quiz. You only have 30 minutes, so you need to study anyway. All right, I will go over the chapter 1 summary with you very quickly. Again, you don't have to listen to this part if you think you've got it. Psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. The scientific method involves 5 steps: question, hypothesis, experiment, analyze, and publish. Wilhelm Wundt was the first person to be called a psychologist. He is German. He wrote the Principles of Physiological Psychology back in 1873. He also opened the first psychology lab and really kind of got psychology started as a science. He studied structuralism, or believed in structuralism, which focuses on the different components of the mind through introspection. William James, around the same time, was the first American psychologist. He believed more in functionalism, which rather than looking at the parts of the mind, looked at the mind as a whole, and how our mental activities could help us fit into our environment. He was into the evolutionary stuff. Then came Sigmund Freud. He was focused on the unconscious, psychoanalytic theory, childhood experiences, dream analysis, all that kind of introspective stuff. Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler were German and escaped to the US, and they kind of brought in the principles of Gestalt, which are seeing things as a whole instead of as their parts. Then came behaviorism with Pavlov, who studied classical conditioning and got the dogs to drool over the bell ringing. John B. Watson, considered the father of behaviorism. And then Skinner, who worked with operant conditioning and studied how behavior is influenced by its consequences. He had the rats pressing the lever for the food. Behaviorism is defined as observing and controlling behavior. So we're not just observing, not just collecting data, but also learning how to control behavior, right? How to condition people or animals. Humanism, around the same time, emphasized personal control, intentionality, and a true disposition for good. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist best known for proposing the hierarchy of needs. Remember, you need to meet those basic needs before you meet your psychological needs and eventually reach self-actualization. Carl Rogers was also a humanist. He was known for his client-centered therapy, which says that therapists should have 3 traits: unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy, and the client takes care of the rest. The cognitive revolution was started by Noam Chomsky and other cognitive psychologists who revived the interest in the mind by showing that it could be studied scientifically. This involved cognitive sciences, which is when the psychologists began to cooperate with scientists in other fields, like linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience. Noam Chomsky was a linguist, and he was really the one who wanted to refocus psychology to the mind rather than behavior. Naomi Weinstein was the first feminist psychologist who started the feminist revolution in psychology by criticizing how scientific it could really be if men were defining women. Francis Cecil Sumner was the first African-American psychologist who served as the chair of the psychology department at Howard University. Multicultural psychologists they develop theories and conduct research with diverse populations all within one country or one region, whereas cross-cultural psychologists, you can remember, they kind of go across the world, right? They cross back and forth to different countries to study populations across countries. The APA, or the American Psychological Association, was founded in 1892. It's the largest organization of psychologists in the world. We also learned a bit about the APS, but for this purpose, we care a little more about the APA. Now I will go quickly through the different disciplines or areas of psychology. Biopsychology studies how biology influences behavior. They use the biopsychosocial model, which asserts that biology, psychology, and social factors interact to determine an individual's health. Clinical psychology focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders. Cognitive psychology studies cognitions or thoughts and their relationship to experiences and actions. Counseling psychology focuses on the emotional, social, vocational, and other aspects of the lives of psychologically healthy individuals, people without diagnoses. Developmental psychology studies the development across the lifespan. Forensic psychology uses psychology in the justice system or the courtroom. Personality psychology studies personality traits, which are consistent patterns of thoughts and behavior that make each individual unique, and personality traits are stable over time and have predictive value. Sport and exercise psychology focuses on the interactions between mental and emotional factors and physical performance in sports, exercise, and other activities. Our last definition on our summary slide, a PsyD is a Doctor of Psychology, which is a doctoral degree that places less emphasis on research and more on clinical. So research-based psychologists would get a PhD in psychology, and clinical-based psychologists would get a PsyD. Two different